Alrighty, we're gonna get rolling here. So we got part 6 today. We worked on some form submission stuff yesterday. We got our data persistent on the back end, but we still need to figure out how to get that nice, clean, snappy update on the front end as well. So we'll start by taking care of that. And then I want to talk a little bit about conditional rendering. There are a few different ways that you can handle it in React, all effective, some a little, I think, cleaner syntactically than others. So we'll talk about a few different ways you can handle that. And I will say, I think that one of the features, if you will, that I like the most about working with JSX and React is nice, like inline conditional rendering. So we'll go over that. I have some stuff linked from last time in terms of resources, like just the page on forms, and we've got a section on the conditional rendering. So that will be our topic for today. And then next time will probably be our last lesson in the series. And I kind of want to just kind of sum it all up together and talk about state, right? And single source of truth, stuff like that, now that we have the app mostly completed. So any questions on objectives before we start? All right, let's dive in then. So to recap a little bit where we left off, I'm going to zoom out briefly. Can you guys still read that? Kind of? Okay. Just going to orient ourselves a little bit. So we were working on getting this form. Actually, you know what? I don't have the app running, and if anyone else doesn't, let's npm start so we can take a look at it together. While we wait for it to load up, we'll go over our structure here. So we had our handle submit event, right? We basically have it sending out a fetch request when that part of it, when our save button or our submit button is clicked. That will submit the entire form because it's button type submit. And so we can tie our handle submit function or method right onto the form itself. You could also potentially just attach like a click event to the button. Preference. So we're preventing default action. We're sending out our fetch request. We're getting it coming back successfully. And so that's kind of the post, or new post actually might be a better variable name or parameter name here. Let's call it new post. And we kind of discussed right at the end that this would be the area to do something with this new GIF, right? We talked about how when it comes back, it should come back with an ID. And in fact, we can test out our app really quickly. It looks like we've accumulated a number of these exploding GIFs. Shoot, I actually don't have a URL handy. Let's look one up real quick. Just take one of the most popular ones that's on Jiffy right now. Come on. Struggling to load. All right, cool. We'll take this one. So if we go to post a new GIF, paste in the URL, cool GIF here. Oh, we're still logging state. I'm going to clear that out. And when we submit, we get this nice response. It's been created, and we see we have we basically have the object that we just posted under this created key. So we have the description, we have the URL, and we have a new ID from the database. So we're in really good shape now, but we need to update the front end, right? If we scroll down to the bottom of our list, we don't have the new GIF here. If we refresh, we'll see it, but we want that snappy, I just click submit and my new thing pops up on the page. So does anyone have any ideas on how we could handle this? Because there's a couple ways we could do it. I want to give you a little time to think about it. Say at least like 10 good seconds. And if you're coming up empty, that's fine. All right, any thoughts, or it doesn't have to be a complete solution, but some thoughts on how we could get there. Yeah, Mark.
This dot set state something?
Yes, this dot set state something. Let's make a little note, like this dot set state something. we're probably going to need to change state in some way, somewhere. Great thought. Anyone have anything else? All right, cool, that's fine. So your head is absolutely in the right place, Mark. We are going to need to change state. And it probably makes sense. We have this full resource, basically. We have the new thing that we want to put into state formatted for us. as part of the response that we're getting back from our backend. So we can use this new post in some way to get it into our application state. Now, one issue that we'll have is that we have this handle submit method written down in the GIF form, right? And we're controlling the state of the form down here, but we don't really have access since this is a bound function or method, right? This is bound to this particular class, to this particular component in our hierarchy. We can't call setState directly, or I should say we can. If we call setState directly here, we're going to be modifying the state of this particular component. Whereas what we really want to do is get somehow back up to app.js and modify state up here so that we can update our GIFs array and add in this new one. It's very similar in a sense, although we didn't do the data persistence, right, with delete GIF. We are modifying state, right? We're filtering to remove that one by ID and then setting state again. So if we need to set state, but we need to modify the state of this app.js component, what we can do is essentially write kind of like a helper function up here in app.js, pass that down to our form, and then pass that function the relevant data that it needs to be able to update state appropriately. So first things first, let's write a method on app.js state. We can make a little space maybe right below delete GIF. And what do you guys think would be a good name for this method?
Add GIF to state.
Love it. Let's do that. Add GIF to... Sure, why not? Let's be super explicit. Add GIF to global state.
Callback.
Callback function here. All right, we'll leave that part off. Whoops. And we do want to bind its context, that's this value, to this particular component. So we'll do our new syntax. So we'll bind it with our fat arrow function here. And we already kind of noted we're going to need to call this .setState somewhere and pass it a new array, let's say. Whoops, didn't mean to capitalize. Let's do a little pseudocode. And if we're going to be able to add the newly posted GIF with this method, it's probably going to need to receive new GIF somewhere, right? I'll zoom in a little bit now. So let's declare new GIF as a parameter that this method is going to receive. So it'll receive the new GIF. We've got that kind of theoretically taken care of here. And then let's pseudocode out the rest. And we can follow the model a little bit of delete GIF. So what are some of the next steps that we're going to need to take? We'll set this method up to receive the new GIF. And we have access to the new one as part of this new post that comes back. So what else are we going to need to do? Like, let's look at delete GIF. We eventually, here, you know what, let's move this also. We eventually want to get to the point where we can set state, but we're going to need to do some stuff in between. So let's look at what we did with delete GIF. What would be one step that we need to take here?
Does new GIF or new GIF, whatever, does that need to be up in state?
It's going to need to be, we're going to need to put it into state.
It's going to go into GIFs.
It'll go, yeah, it needs to go into GIFs, exactly.
Is it already formatted as an object to match what's in GIFs already?
Great question. Is it already formatted as an object in the right way? Let's, we got to refresh because I changed something. Let's post another one and let's see what it looks like when it comes back. Oh, let's do this one. Let's have a great day. So if we submit a link, we'll do a little description. I got to remove that console log. So when we submit it, this is the object that comes back. Let me zoom this in. So it's an object with the key of created, and then it looks like created has the values sort of like, this is essentially what we want to put on state. This is the same format as the other GIFs in our array. So we won't be able to set exactly what came back from the API on state, but the data we need in the structure we need is within it. So we'll have a complete GIF object, essentially. We just need to access it with dot notation.
And what's in your state array for this
An object with an array of objects that have these three properties.
So we've got the object. It's called create.
Yes, we've got the object, precisely.
So uh, you got you would do the you would need the new GIF dot created unshift or no unshift new GIF and then
So yeah,
like
new
down on this down on this level.
new post doc. Well, no, you mentioned new post doc created, so I'm just going to add that in. That represents the object we want. We'll store it in a variable. And then you mentioned we could unshift, which would put it right up at the top. So we could unshift. Another way I was thinking is we could push, right? We could also concat. You guys worked with the concat method before? Essentially just merges to, like we can merge an object into an array with that. Yeah.
The destructuring, that'd be a good thing to do. Just build a new array and destructure the other one and add the element.
Destructure, like which part of it?
Destructure the state GIF list into another GIF list array.
Yeah, totally. I'm not going to do the destructuring syntax right now because I don't know if everyone's comfortable with it, but yeah, exactly the right idea. So we'll receive the new GIF here. We will capture, let's say, like a snapshot of the current state GIFs array, and then I'm going to just say add because there's a lot of different ways we could do it, and one or the other is not necessarily more right or wrong. Say add the new GIF into the GIFs array, and then we can set state. Cool. So let's do it. We've got the new GIF coming in. Capture the current state of the GIFs array. So Michael was suggesting we do some destructuring. I want to do another kind of spiral of a series where we do a lot of destructuring and like the latest and greatest syntax for everything. But for right now, let's just do const current GIFs equals this dot state dot GIFs. And I'm going to do another constant, and we can call it updated GIFs equals this dot state dot GIFs dot concat. And then what we can pass to the concat is the new GIF. And the reason why I'm doing it this way is this returns a new array with the new resource added to it. It's a little bit more of a React-y way, like don't mutate state directly. Yes, we're avoiding that anyways, so we could push into this one. We could make this like let GIFs equals this dot state dot GIFs and then push or unshift. But I'm just going to roll with concat. I'm going to roll with concat. So right now, let's just log updated GIFs and see if that's coming through the way we wanted. So we're not getting to the set state just yet, but we should be able to see the new array that we want to set on state once we use this method. So what we need to do now, though, we're all the way up in app.js, so we need to get this down to our GIF component, right? So, or to our form component, excuse me. So now GIF form can actually receive some data here. We'll give it a prop. Add GIF to global state equals our curlies, add GIF to global state. And down in the form, now we should be able to reference it within our form. So instead of just console logging new post dot created, actually I want to remove that console log of state. Where is that coming from? I think that's inside GIF. Nope. App.js, form. Oh, that's where it is. Let's get rid of this. We don't need this little callback after we set state because we know that form is working right. So app.js, back to the GIF form. So now we can call that method right within our handle submit method down here. And so how can we call it? The name of it was add GIF to global state. Props, yeah. But since we're in a class, we need this dot props dot add GIF to global state. And then since we're in like a regular JavaScript block here, we can just invoke it and we can pass it the new GIF. And so actually instead of console logging, I'm going to do const new GIF equals new post.created. And now we can just pass new GIF right into this method. And so if all goes well, we should see the new GIF being logged out because that's kind of how we have it wired right here. Or we won't see the new GIF. We'll see the new GIF array, right? Receives the new one, puts it into updated GIFs. So let's try it out. Did I save? Yeah. Okay. Just copy this link once more. I know whoa. What happened? Add GIF to global state is not defined. Oh, I made a mistake up in app.js, I think. This dot add GIF to global state. Cool. We have to reference the class first. So let's see if it remembers. Yes, very nice. Clear these, and when we submit, cool. Our current number was 27. So this is sort of a snapshot of the previous state. And now we have an array of 28. And if we open it up and take a peek at the very last one, we have this new ID. Yeah, very nice. That's the description that I just entered into the form right here. So we are creating this new array very nicely. Didn't mean to double up on very nice is there. So now, so now we need to modify this one to actually affect state. So let's go back to the method in app.js, and we can pull our final move here. So we'll call this dot set state, invoke it, declare an object to pass it, and we'll do we'll do GIFs, set it equal to updated GIFs that we just created here. And now we go back to the app and we submit one more time. You can probably zoom this out a little bit now. Let's grab one more image. We'll do Stewie here. He's really excited that we're getting our app fully working. So we'll paste that in. Stewie. And we submit. And it probably would have been a nice feature if we had like reverse the array or something and have them show up at the top. But if we scroll all the way down, now we have our new GIF on state, appearing basically as soon as we press the button. And so now we've created this awesome synchronicity between our back end and our front end. If we open up the console again, we see our number of GIFs update. If we submit again, we see it update again, right? So everything is wired up nicely. Our components are all communicating with each other. And we now have data persistence and our local like front end updating essentially at the same time. And if you wanted to, I'm not going to do this. I would challenge you to do this on your own. But a really good thing to do would be down in the GIF form would be to check to see if the post actually succeeded. So the API is set up to send back an error. Actually, we can just do this real quick, right? So if we don't submit a URL, oh boy, it actually just breaks entirely. Oh, and that's because we're not validating here, because we put an object in state that shouldn't have gone there. So we got an error from the API, but we're no longer logging the response down in the form, right? We got rid of that log. So let's do it together really quickly. I think we got time for this. So I'm going to just comment that stuff out so it doesn't get executed and we don't throw errors like that. So let's bring back our log of new post so we can see what it looks like in the event that we make a mistake. So let's get rid of this. So if we submit an incorrect URL, I thought that we got a response. Well, thought it was going to send back an actual error here, or like a JSON message with an error. It's possible that I didn't update the API, the deployed link to do that. No, there we go. I don't know why it didn't fire at first. So we get this error, invalid input. We get some information about why it's invalid. I think we mentioned last time you could display that to the user to let them know what kind of mistake they made. But what we can check for is this error. Because if it succeeds, we just get the new post. So what we can do to account for this is we can just put some conditional logic. So if there is not an error, right? So if not new post dot error, then we can execute the rest of our logic, and otherwise it'll just do nothing, right? So ultimately it would be better to let the user know in some way, but in the interest of saving some time, I'm not going to do that. But if we go back to our app now, do a quick hard refresh just to make sure we have the latest code in the browser. Now, if we screw up our submission and we submit, we get the error, but we don't get our app crashing, right? So that's actually really important. And if we do submit it properly, we should get a new GIF. We'll get a new GIF popping up because that's the condition that we've checked against. This code won't work for every API. It'll depend if they send you back an error message. Most of them will, though, in some way. So I just want to show you it's good to account for the post actually succeeding before you start trying to modify your front end. Cool. That was sort of our first objective for today. Are there any questions on what we just did? Yeah, Matt.
Could you use a force update? Or is that
It's so yeah. Forcing an update is generally wouldn't be a best practice. Can you elaborate a little bit more, like where or why you would want to do that? Like in app.js, forcing an update? Is that what you're thinking?
Well, I was wondering if you put the force update inside the function, or just call that and submit, or just update the individual, like, list.
So if we put a force update like in the
Inside functionality instead of the set state.
that might work. It might work.
I was wondering if that, again, it says to avoid doing that, but I was wondering whether.
I haven't tried it. I think it probably would if it would force it to rerun its component did mount function. Using force update, as they mentioned, is not really a best practice. You want to avoid it, but here's how you could handle it kind of that way without using force update. If we extracted this fetch request into a function, well, actually, honestly, what we could do is just call the component did mount function in here. So that would fetch new data, right? So if we comment this out and we call component did mount, I don't know if this would be considered a best practice either. What I was going to suggest is we could extract this fetch into a named function or method called like fetch data or something like that. And in component did mount, call that, and then reuse it to fetch the data again here. But let's see if this works. I know that doing it the way I just described will work. This looks like an interesting outfit. So let's see what we get. We'll post in our URL, another GIF, submit, and we do get an update. So it pops up right there at the bottom. The downside to doing, this is sort of what I would call the quick and dirty way of doing it. But the downside is that, and the reason why I say dirty, is that you're sending out a whole nother request. So over the course of time, like performance is going to degrade doing it this way. Whereas we already have sent out a request, like doing it the way I first showed you, we've already sent out a request. We already have the resource that we wanted coming back to us. And so let's just use that and just run some front-end logic to get it into state. But there's nothing like drastically wrong with, I probably would refactor this to not just call component did mount, but to extract this into a method, the fetch, and call that again. And that's a pretty fail-safe way to make sure you have the latest information, because that will make sure you're in sync with the back end. But I would do that instead of forcing an update. Good question. Any other questions? I'll comment this out and bring back the code that we had. All right, cool. Let's move on to conditional rendering. So what I'd like you all to do is spend a few minutes reading through this section of the documentation on conditional rendering. As I mentioned, there's a few different ways of handling this. I think they maybe even talk about 4 different ways of doing it on this page. But what I'd like you to do, definitely read this first part, right? You can read element variables if you want. I'm not directly going to cover them today, so you can skip that section. But definitely read this section on inline if with logical double ampersand operator, and this section on inline if else. Both of these use newer syntax than this first section talks about. It's all the same concepts though, checking a condition and rendering part of the app based on that condition. So let's do this a little meatier. Let's do like 4 minutes or so to read and take a peek at, and you don't have to worry about this prevent component from rendering part, but definitely read the first section and then read the ones about the inline operators. So let's do 4 minutes and then we can have some discussion around it. And if you, during this time, want to try and implement some conditional rendering, go right ahead. I'll be right back. If you have any questions as you're reading, I'll be browsing. Another minute 15 or so for reading. All right, last few seconds for reading. We'll stop 5 seconds early. We'll avoid that beep. And let's do 2 minutes for a turn and talk with the person next to you or the people at your table on these different styles of conditional rendering and how they work. And then we can take some notes together.
About 30 seconds left to talk to each other.
Another 10 seconds or so. All right, I'm going to stop before the beep here. Cool. So let's chat together now, and let's come up with some notes and some consensus on how we can handle this. So let's say we want to implement conditional rendering on our app. Can I get a volunteer just to tell me what's one way that we could approach that, just in your own words?
If something's true, render the following things.
Yeah, awesome. If something is true, render the following things/components, let's say, perhaps. Nice. Anyone want to add anything else? No pun intended.
I mean, you would specify else, but usually else is implied to do the opposite of what it is.
Yep, else is usually implied to do the opposite. Whoops, this opposite. The opposite. I want to add in that there's multiple approaches. Can't spell this morning, but they all come down to conditional logic, which is basically just if-else control flow type statements. So different syntax, a few different ways we can approach the syntax, and a few different places we can put the syntax, but it's really just all logical operators. Like just as Mark said, it really boils down to if something is true, render the following things, and there's some syntax that we can use where we don't have an else condition, we don't have a false condition, but for the most part, the else is implied with some of the syntax and explicit with some of the syntax as well. So let's talk for a minute also about why you would want or need to use conditional rendering. Can anyone think of an example of when you would want conditional rendering? Yeah.
Well, I was reading through the docs, the one that I saw that kind of struck me because I never really thought about it. When you go onto a website that you're logged into normally, or you sign into, your component can change from when you're signed in to say sign out, like, or vice versa. And now I didn't even realize that was going on.
Yeah. Very nice. That's like a perfect example, right? We ideally want to deliver our users as good of experience as possible. So when you show up to a site and you don't have an account there or you're not logged into your account, you typically will see buttons, let's say in the header, that say, well, we don't have this on our app yet, or we won't, but you see little buttons in that say like sign up or log in. Whereas if you're already logged in, you see a button to sign out. I also had like sort of a brain revelation when I first implemented some conditional rendering to be like, wow, that's what's happening, and that's a really slick way to handle that situation. Nice. Any other examples come to mind? Or any other, let's think very specifically in the context of a React app, why we might actually need conditional rendering to help prevent issues. Think about the asynchronicity of some of the stuff that we're doing. Anyone have a thought? Danny?
Maybe with this one, since it's rendering individual GIFs, you could say it's not getting information, we can have something, a message there saying that.
Yeah.
So it tells the user what's going on rather than just like an empty page.
Yeah, think about our first load. So Danny's saying it would probably be nice if we could let the user know that something is happening before the GIFs exist on the page. And this is a huge benefit of front-end frameworks in terms of the way this can be implemented, in my opinion. It also is just something that you want to start thinking about in terms of producing good user experiences and user interfaces in general, right? It can be very frustrating. Research shows that after about a second, and sometimes even before, of a page loading, if stuff isn't appearing as it should, users start to get pissed off. And a second isn't that much time. I mean, I guess to a computer it's kind of a lot of time. But when you have a lot of requests flying back and forth, when someone's sitting at a blank page, they're like, is this app broken? What's happening? I'm not sure. Should I just leave? So why do we want or need? Let's add in provides an important, and I'm going to bold that or italicize that, an important part of user experience. Users want to know when apps are working / broken. Let the user know about async data, let's say, loading. So I will also say on these same lines, like with the same token here, you can actually create not quite bugs, but your app can explode if you don't properly control for asynchronous data being loaded. So we didn't run into an issue with it in this app, but I just want to let you know that if you don't account for data being loaded, you may end up with errors further down your hierarchy because, for example, we load all our GIF data in app.js and then we pass it down. And we're accessing parts of that state through like dot notation. And JavaScript gets very upset if you're trying to access something with dot notation or trying to access something out of an array with mapping or just accessing index values if that resource isn't available yet. So we didn't run into issues with this app, but probably the most important conditional rendering you can account for is up on your app level state. Or if any component you have that's sending out a request for data in its component did mount, you probably should account for the data not being available at first with some conditional rendering. So that's a really nice list that we have. Let's see it in action. So the first thing that I'm going to do is actually add another property to app level state. And I'm going to call it is data loaded. And we'll initialize that value to false. So we now have this property on state that we can check against. A Boolean value is usually the go-to thing. And what we can do is flip this Boolean value when the data becomes available and then conditionally render kind of the rest of the application because it's the whole rest of the app that's depending on this in one way, shape, or form. So let's go down to our render. Actually, you know what? First, let's set it up for this value to be changed to true. So where would we want to do that? The form, maybe the form. Let's think about more of our initial page load before anyone has maybe even entered anything into the form. So we'll do a hard refresh. We see number of GIFs 0, and then the data loads, and then we see the rest of the app loads. So Anyone have a thought? Yeah.
Would you do it in your component mount?
Yeah, do it in component did map. Exactly right. Basically, after we've gotten the data, which would be right in here when we're doing our initial setting of state, aside from like the starting values. So what we can do is we can set GIFs to be the data that came back from the API, and then we can set is data loaded to be true. So a request goes out when the app sort of first spins up, data comes back, and then we change this property to true so we can use it conditionally. So one way that they show you is writing like if-else statements right within the render. So we could do like if this dot state dot is data loaded, and we don't even have to do equals true because this statement itself evaluates to true or false. Initially it's false, right? And then once it gets flipped. And what we could do is we could return a whole nother render function and don't render the, let's see, what's depending on state. GIF form, GIF list, those are all depending on state. GIF count is too. So we could just extract those right out, and basically our app is just like the two headers to start. Or perhaps we could leave in the GIF count, because that's just depending on the length of what initially is an empty array. But let's cut them all out for right now. And, whoops, let's hard refresh. Let's see what happens. Oh, whoops, forgot to check against the opposite. Wait, what's going on here? If the data is loaded, oh, I set my initial value to true. No, I didn't. Is data loaded. Let's try this again. That's definitely not doing what I thought it was going to. If this state.data is loaded equals true, let's try that. Oh no. If it's not, I'm just being a fool here. If the data has not been loaded, I was doing this opposite. I should have put this if condition. If it's loaded, render the whole app, else render this. But we're doing it, the order doesn't actually matter, but I was doing my logic wrong. So when the data isn't loaded, we just see hello and goodbye world, and then it never loads.
Because there's one return.
Honestly, I don't usually do it this way, and clearly I'm screwing it up somehow. Oh, there we go. I think it just, I needed to do a hard refresh so it had the latest. So initially, we have nothing, and then boom, the rest of the app pops into view. So you can do it this way. I mostly just wanted to show you can do it with straight up if-else statements. A way that I prefer to do it, and that I think is a lot cleaner syntactically, is that we can use, I mentioned that they have these sections on inline operators. So we can use double ampersand, and we can use ternary operators. So let's just get a quick show of hands, who's used a ternary before? All right, like everyone. So perfect. So here's what I would consider a cleaner way of doing that. What we can do, and you don't have to do this step, right? You can check directly against state, but I like to declare constants. So I'm going to make a constant called is loaded or is data loaded, and just set that equal to this dot state dot is data loaded. So every time the render happens, we'll capture the value from state. I just like to store it in a variable because that variable then reads like plain English. So what we can do is now check against this condition. So we decided it's pretty much our counter, our form, and our list are all depending on state in some way. So we can take advantage of JSX, and we can just wrap all of those in curlies. And now it's going to look a little awkward because it's a bunch of components that are depending on it. Now we can check against our condition. So we can do is data loaded. That's just a true or false value on state. And if we want all of these to just load when it's available and not load when it's not, we can use that double ampersand. So let's do it like this. Doesn't matter where you put this because of white space. I don't know if I like it there. I'm just going to do it like this. So if the data is loaded, and do these things. And the reason why this works in, this is just regular JavaScript. It just may be syntax you haven't seen before. It's basically like if this statement evaluates to true, then these will evaluate to true as well. Then these will come out. If it evaluates to false, then the whole statement's false, so the components don't get rendered. And let's see what we get here. Back to the app, hard refresh. Oh, adjacent JSX tags. Got to add in our div. I guess not. I usually do this with more with like single components, which we could refactor it to do. Let's see how this works. Cool. So that's working as expected. That's one way you can handle this. We probably would want to space this in to be a little more clear. Oftentimes with apps, you may not have to do this on quite so many components. So let's see what it would look like if we didn't have to do it for like 3 components at once. Because ultimately, the counter will work okay because it'll just display 0 at first. And that's some information for the user. The form is probably okay because it's very unlikely that someone's going to be able to enter in a request before the data shows up. So let's just do it with the GIF list. So again, we'll just highlight, open up curly so everything's wrapped, and then we can check our condition again. Is data loaded, double ampersand. Let's break it to a new line. Then render the GIF list. Let's see what that produces for a user experience. Hard refresh. Cool, so we see a little bit of information, then the data loads, and the other components are affected appropriately. Because this one is just returning one component, so it doesn't need enclosing tags because it's just one at a time. So we could now then, if we wanted, like wrap all these components in their own statement and check against is data loaded. That's a stylistic thing. You can handle that however you would like. But I want to point out that this still isn't the best user experience, right? We're still not getting a lot of information. We're not letting the user know in any way that something's happening behind the scenes. So, there are a few ways that you can handle giving the user some info. The easiest and the quickest is basically just to tell them that the page is loading. And what we can do for this is we can use not just the double ampersand operator, which is just a true statement check, right? We can use the if else, and this is where the ternary comes in. So let's refactor this to use ternary. So instead of just one true condition, really what we want is a true-false condition. So we'll do a question mark, and then in ternaries, the first thing that comes after the question mark is the true condition. Maybe I will break this down onto a new line now. And then the next thing would be the false condition. What do we do if that statement evaluates to false? So this will be our false condition. And we're in JSX, so we can just put a string right in here. Or maybe an H2 is probably more appropriate, or some sort of text element, right? Whoa. Yeah, okay, cool. So let's do an H2. No? H2? There we go. Let's do an H2 that just says loading, ... And I'm going to move this just onto this line. I might read a little cleaner. Cool. So is data loaded, true condition, false condition. So if the data isn't available, just let the user know that the data is being loaded. And we'll do a hard refresh and see how that comes out. Nope. There, oh yeah, you can see it. It's just a flash. Yeah, it's real quick. Because our Heroku app is awake and is loading pretty quickly, but you can see it right about here. Loading. Boom. Then the data is available. Now the rest of the app kind of renders. If you've used an application, if you use any modern web app and you see like a spinner or some kind of loading indicator, what I like to do is basically make a component that's a spinner And I would encourage you to play around with this on your own, but make a component that's a spinner, import it into any part of the application that's going to be loading data, and you want to let the user know. And then instead of just rendering an H2, you render that spinner component. So you can reuse that all across your app. So that can be happening on first page load. It can be happening once you submit a form, say, or when you're editing something. You can get a lot of mileage out of one solid spinner component. And, whoops. And if you search for like spinner component or, I don't know, let's say, come on Google, loading spinner, that's probably a better Google search. You can find tons of GIFs or custom little pieces of code that you can just pull into your project. Yeah, question?
So, just to make sure, because like obviously ours is loading really quickly, so you see like for a second. Is there a way to like pause the data transfer so you can like really make sure that thing's working properly where it's supposed to be?
Yeah, what you can do, great question. So the question was about like, can we make it so the data doesn't load or something like that so we can test it? Just change this to false so that it never becomes true in your set state. And then if we go back to the app, do a hard refresh, now we see loading, and that value is never going to become true. So yeah, that's the perfect way to test it. All you have to do is not include this line entirely, or have it there and just keep it as false. Yeah, good question. Yeah, you can. Mark's right. You can go into your like network tab and maybe it's performance. No, somewhere in here you can simulate different connection speeds. I don't have it off the top of my head, but you can in the dev tools choose like a 3G connection, which is actually really great for testing your app and seeing how it would load on a phone, say, or in an area where the internet just isn't that great. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. I think they also talk about in the docs, I was like, you can skip this section, but they talk about basically storing components in variables and just rendering the variable. So you can control what the variable assignment becomes. So they just declare a button element, or excuse me, a button variable, and then check on a is logged in condition. And if they're logged in, then they render the button is the log out button, and otherwise it's the log in button, and then you just template in the button, which is very, very similar to what we did with our paragraphs right here, where we were just templating in like paragraphs. Also similar to what we're doing in the GIF list, where we construct the GIF components and then just template those right in. So you can write your if-else statements outside of the return function. When you are templating yourself, when you are doing the inline templating, I believe if you start writing like if-else statements right in there, those won't work. So if you're doing it right within the template, the logic, just use the double ampersand or the ternary. Sweet. Can I get a fist of 5 on how comfortable you feel implementing some type of conditional rendering in your own apps? Sweet. Fantastic. So we've got some notes here on our conditional rendering. Form submission, I want to make a note. Form submission, actually it's specifically on modifying state on the front end. We can, a couple different approaches, right? We can fetch data again, or we can use resource that was just posted to update state. And let's make a note on that one, which that is more performant. So ultimately, more ideal. Sweet. I think that wraps it for today. Any questions in general on what we covered? See, Matt's ready to clap. I'll send out objectives for tomorrow, or probably won't do it tomorrow. I'll probably do it on Monday. I'll send out some objectives. Oh yeah, next time because you guys are on break. Maybe I'll even record a little video, but I want us to have a group discussion on state also. So we'll get to that, and come with any more questions you have. And there's a section I think I linked previously on thinking in React. Just want to point out that this is a really good resource for translating, for those of you who are working on dyno drills in particular, there's some good info here on like transferring basically like non-React code into React code. So, and they talk about thinking about things in terms of state and props and stuff like that. So, thank you again so much for your time, and we'll pick up when you're back from break.
Thanks, man.